Hello, welcome to episode 28 of Glass Onion on John Lennon. So we're back to the normal programming again. Hope you enjoyed the bonus episode, if you listened to that, with Jude and Lena of the She Said podcast. I actually made another guest appearance last week. I'm recording this on the 7th of February, and that was on a show called Tomorrow Never Knows. I think that's only on YouTube at the moment. It's with Bob Wilson and Warren Brown, and the YouTube channel is actually Warren Brown, The Beatles Kingdom. They're putting that show out with frightening regularity. It's not quite daily, but certainly a few times a week. It was a lovely show. It was ostensibly about the White Album, but I said in advance to the guys, ask me anything you want, some random questions, and they did, and it was great. And the conversation did go to some other places, and we ended up discussing, in fact, the JFK assassination, but I don't think that's going to be part of the conversation. I think that's a conversation for another day. I also mentioned at some point that I was a musician, and they actually got me to play, I think I played 4 songs in the end from the White Album, plus a little bit of the song The End, which is how they traditionally close their show. My guitar was a bit out of tune. I got a couple of chords wrong, because it was very off the cuff. But it was nice and good to be under a bit of pressure, actually. Perhaps maybe perform better, who knows. I felt very relaxed. It's lovely when you get that kind of feeling from podcast hosts, and we had a lot of fun as well. And that's a little segue, because today's episode was also a lot of fun. This is Scott Phipps back again, aka Bob Balaban, if you're on Facebook. Scott and I talked about the Imagine 1972 film in November, I think it was. And we planned at the time to talk about the Imagine 1988 film, and here it is, finally, we got there. We recorded it in January, and there's actually a reference to Harry and Meghan leaving the royal family. That now seems like ages ago. The news cycle goes so quickly, so we don't have to ever concentrate on anything for too long. Keep those attention spans short. And Scott, as I mentioned last time he was on the show, has at the moment 3 podcasts: Real Britannia, RWL, Stinking Paws, PAUSE, and Rainbow Valley, which is the one that I originally got to know him from. And yeah, it was a lot of fun, this talk. Scott and I kind of riff on a few things. We go chronologically through the film with multiple tangents, as is customary. We go off in a few different directions, but I thought it was a really good conversation. There's lots of facts, some to do with the Imagine film and some not. I've put in a few audio clips as well. Lauren Hardy fans, there's a clip for you coming up at some point towards the end of the part 1 of the conversation today. And we also talk about George Martin on speed. Well, we don't really talk about it. It's more, I'd say we more mention it. We don't go into deep analysis about that. But yeah, lots of fun. Today we'll see the debut of the new outro music. Hopefully the intro music, it's the second time I've used it. Hopefully it's working for you. And then last week we heard the full song Life Goes On, but today you're going to hear the outro instrumental, but I'll get to that at the end of the talk. What else? I think that's about it, actually. A bit of a short intro. They were getting longer and longer, weren't they? I think the longest one so far has been 15 minutes, but it's my version of the Dick Cavett monologues from his shows, which are all over YouTube now. I watch a lot of those. If you've never heard of Dick Cavett, by the way, he had a talk show from the late 60s, I think through to the 90s, or changed a few times. He was on different networks, but the classic one is sort of late 60s, early 70s, and he had 2 Beatles, in fact, with John Lennon with Yoko Ono twice, and then George Harrison was on it as well, and there's loads of other people that I personally love as cultural figures, like Marlon Brando, Muhammad Ali, and Woody Allen, and plenty of others. Paul Simon, I've just watched a clip of him talking about how he produced Bridge Over Troubled Water. There's another one talking about the construction of Mrs. Robinson. So, very good stuff. Anyway, refreshingly short intro, so let's go straight to the conversation, and I'll be back at the end with a few words. Enjoy. Hi Scott, how are you?
Hey Anthony, all good mate, very well sir, thank you.
Back again?
Again, yes. Did overrun slightly last time, so let's see how we go with this one.
I'll just direct listeners back to episode 24, which is only a couple of episodes ago, where we did the Imagine 1972 film, and we also talked for 20-25 minutes about your history with John Lennon. So.
Yeah, there was a lot we covered in that 90 minutes plus, mate, yeah, definitely.
So this is kind of a part 2, because we did the first Imagine film, and we're going to tackle the 1988 one. As I said last time, there were 4 films, or there have been 4 films connected with this project. I'll go through them all again. But this is probably, I suppose, the most expansive, because it's really about his whole life, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the one I'm most familiar as well, being sort of 18, 19 when this came out. This and the Complete Beatles, I think, were my turn to video biographies, basically, when I was a teenager. And yeah, it was interesting, the time of release when this came out, because it was a massive publicity campaign. There was an accompanying soundtrack album, wasn't there, with it, which had a couple of demos that hadn't been released before, as well as some Beatles tracks and things. It was great. It was very, very popular. But I'm going to ask you a question, because I was just doing a little bit of research before we start. Do you know if this had a cinema release in this country? Because I don't think it did, according to the research I was looking at today.
I'm not sure, because it would have been just before I kind of got into the group.
Yeah. I was looking at the box office returns, and the international, it made something like 4.5 million worldwide.
That's quite a small amount, isn't it?
Yeah, 4.5 million total, and it was re-released in 2010, I think. It had another cinema release, obviously for the anniversaries. But then again, 4.5 million, I doubt if it cost that much to actually produce, to be honest, because most of it's existing, film footage from Yoko's collection and such. So
I think if you kind of trace how popular the Beatles have been since they've broken up, obviously the 70s, there was all the influence of the 60s. Their influence was still being felt.
Yeah.
There was definitely a dip in the 80s, probably even a backlash, I guess, when dance music, or even, before then, probably.
Yeah.
Definitely some kind of feeling of backlash, and they were kind of a nostalgia act.
Yeah, there was a bit of a resurgence in 84. Was it 84? 82 or so, because I think on the 20th anniversary of Love Me Do, they re-released the first half dozen singles, I believe. So there was a little bit of, they got into the charts in the early 80s again. And then obviously this, I think, was sort of piquing the interest again towards the end of the decade.
This is obviously 88.
Before Anthology came about, to be honest, mate, I think.
Yeah, last time, I think we mentioned this, when you were talking about 1980, I was saying it was quite surprising that just like Starting Over, the single, and Double Fantasy didn't shoot anywhere near number 1, in fact.
Yeah.
One of them was number 8, one of them was number 12. I can't remember which is which. And then obviously after the events of December the 8th, they all shot to number 1. But
yeah, it all happened.
But just to say, I think this sort of resurgence, obviously, Britpop and Oasis had a huge sort of 90s, because the 90s was kind of a bit of a 60s revival. And then since then, I think the Beatles are just going to be popular forever now.
Well, that's it. They've cemented their place in social, cultural and, music history forever, mate. There's no doubt about it. Yeah,
that's right. And I watched... we'll get on to let's get straight to the subject. Let's do something new for the Glass Onion podcast. well, almost straight to the topic. You don't want to talk about Harry and Meghan, I suppose? No,
that's the last thing I'd like to talk about. Thank you very much. Yeah.
All right, fair enough. Okay, so to give an overview, basically this is a kind of potted history of his life. He narrates a lot of it through past interviews.
Yeah.
And one of the quite eerie things about it is that one of the interviews that's heavily featured, although you wouldn't know it just by watching it, is the one he did on the day of his death.
Is that the one with Andy Peebles?
No, that was 2 days before.
That was 2 days before, was it? Okay.
I don't think he used any of that. That was a very sort of upbeat interview.
Yeah.
The one on his death, I don't want to get macabre, but it's just so bizarre that on the day of his death, I did an episode on this, by the way, episode 2, listeners. He did like a photo shoot. He was very sort of visible on that day.
Yes.
Then he did this sort of, I think it was 2 to 3 hour interview. He'd already done a photo shoot where he was pictured. They did this amazing picture, I don't know if you've ever seen it, where he's completely naked and Yoko's fully clothed.
Yes, I think I have, yeah.
He's in a fetal embrace.
Yes.
Talk about...
Oh, I know the one. Yes, I definitely know the one, yeah.
No, you can either call them indulgent or honest. I think I've had this debate with my guests many times on this podcast. But that's quite brave, really. But it just so happens that, we've got a naked picture of John Lennon on the day he died. It's just bizarre. And so, yeah, he essentially narrates this film. What's your overall impression of the film?
As I say, it was a staple when it came out. You don't actually realise that he's narrating it, to be honest. It comes up in big letters in the credits at the beginning, narrated by John Lennon through interviews or something like that. But you don't actually realise it's him. It's just John Lennon talking, and it's that voice that we're all so familiar with. You could recognise John Lennon's voice anywhere. And I just like the fact that there's not a lot of in-shot commentaries, like there is face-to-face interviews with Yoko, with Cynthia, with Sean, and I think George Martin, and May Pang. But they're very limited. They're not the focal point. The focal point is John Lennon telling his story in his words through a medium that was, that was recorded decades before, perhaps, some of the interviews that we hear at the time of the events taking place. So when they then marry it up with the visuals, I'm not saying it's a unique concept, because I'm sure it must have been done previously, or a version of that sort of documentary style must have been done before. But it just sets it apart from the complete Beatles or any other biography, and doesn't dwell too much on the Beatles as well as an overall sort of observation. It is more the relationship between John and Yoko and his life after the Beatles, I think.
Yeah. Well, it has a very interesting structure, because obviously you can't really go wrong with the Imagine title and the whole sort of white thing that we talked about last time. It's very sort of visually attractive, and just the name Imagine, as apart from the song itself, the name as a film just conjures up all these, possibilities. Imagine,
It's also a completely different beast from the one we spoke about. It's a completely different concept, completely different film. If people haven't seen it, don't get the two confused. They are completely different entities.
This one's kind of, I suppose, slick, but I don't mean that really as a criticism. It's just sort of
it's well produced. I couldn't fault it. I don't think there was anything in there that I found irritating or boring. It's snappy. I think it's an ideal sort of starting point for anybody that wants to know the John Lennon story as well, from start to finish, because it does go back. There's an interview with Aunt Mimi in there, for God's sake, So
yeah, there is. Yeah.
So
that was just a year after he died, actually.
There was. Yeah, I think it was on Nationwide. I think they interviewed her. I remember it being screened at the time.
Yeah, a few people have commented that she wasn't normally as sort of cheery as she sounds there.
There's the stories, isn't it? The famous stories of her being the battle axe and is it in Nowhere Boy? I think, can't think of the lady's name who plays her, but she gives quite an accurate portrayal, apparently.
Yeah, Kristen Scott Thomas.
That's it.
People would have known her from 4 Weddings and a Funeral. She played a sort of stuffy, uptight woman in that as well. But yeah, there's one bit I had to laugh at. Aunt Mimi's sort of narrating, talking about Brian going to see them at the Cavern.
Yes.
And it's it's fine. I mean, I don't want to pick holes in it, but she wasn't happy he was playing at the Cavern at all.
Well, she was the
snobby. Seemed to have a way of not really liking anyone.
No,
really.
She was this snobby aunt, wasn't she? And it was, I don't know, the other Beatles sort of feared her a little bit because of, you had to wipe your feet before you came in. There's all these stories of, bone china being laid out for tea and everything being done properly, whereas you get the impression that, say, George's mum was a bit rough and ready or whatever, it was a completely different class, and it wasn't John at all, that wasn't the way he was originally brought up by his mother, there's this posh sister of hers that actually brought him up, so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, people all know this already, but he had a mother who was more like an aunt or even a big sister.
Yeah.
And in fact, I just interviewed, it'll be out by the time this comes out, I interviewed Colin Hanton, you probably saw that. Who was the drummer of the Quarrymen.
Yes.
He was a little bit older, a couple of years older than John and all the rest of them, obviously like 4 years older than Paul.
Oh, right, yeah.
And he got a job at 15. So he was kind of suited and booted, because in those days, even if you're 15, you seem to wear a suit and tie.
Yep.
And he told me that Aunt Mimi used to let him in through the front door, and famously, she never let anyone in through the front door.
Because he was wearing a suit, he was allowed to come through that way. Excellent.
Yeah, she obviously liked him. So, anyway, we've strayed off topic already.
Again.
Yes. My listeners were getting upset that we were going directly to the topic, you see. I could feel it. They're going, tangents.
It makes a good podcast, I find. It happens on all of mine. I mean, I think you commented once that you dropped into one of my podcasts the other day. It was the Shining one or something, and you was waiting for the review to start, and it was just all this nonsense beforehand. Just carry on, mate. Go with the flow. It really doesn't matter.
I was going to say something about the structure of this film. Going back to what I said about having this Imagine, the name, the logo. It's got that brilliant sort of cartoon. Not cartoon. What do I call it?
Well, it is almost, isn't it? It's a sketch, isn't it? It's a hand-drawn sketch almost, isn't it?
That's the word I was looking for. Of John Lennon, which actually was done by himself. And it's interesting that they kind of have the 1971 recordings and all the stuff that we've seen on the other Imagine documentaries, and they give me some truth. And then they go back to the beginning of his story, and every sort of 5 or 10 minutes they cut back to this 1971.
Yes.
I don't think there's any particular reason to do that, but it works, I think. Maybe it's just like a respite from a straight chronology.
It's sort of telling the story of the making of the Imagine album in between the John Lennon life story. And I'm sure there's a couple of clips that weren't included in the 70s one we saw. You know, the extended bit of the guy that's sleeping in the garden. I'm sure that's not in the original that we watched. But then there are some other bits that we already spoke about. You know, the having a go at the sound engineer when they're singing "Oh Yoko." You know, that's repeated. We're quite familiar with that. Yeah. But I think the good part of that side of the storytelling is when we get the demo versions of Love and other things that we hadn't heard previously. So it's great, and it doesn't detract your mind from the storytelling of the life story. It just seems to flow. It makes sense. I don't know why, but it doesn't appear too jarring. It's not as if there's another bit from 1970 there. Where did that? Why are they showing that? You don't think that while you're watching it at all.
In a way, it's almost difficult for me to be objective about this because when you're 13 or 14 and you watch something like this like 50 times, it's just so burned into your consciousness. It's very hard to actually judge it. But I'll tell you what, I watched it a couple of months ago because we thought we were going to be talking about that back in November.
Yes.
And that was the first time I'd seen it in its entirety for 25 years.
Probably about the same for me, actually.
And the same would happen with Complete Beatles. And I mean, we'll obviously talk about the end of it. But, I had a tear in my eye at the end. And I'll tell you what, there's two reasons. Not only because of the ending, which is very poignant, but just the fact, I was tripping back 25 years because I remembered everything, all the narration.
Yeah.
It was a weird experience. It was brilliant. I've not got even close to being tired of the Beatles and John Lennon. And I don't know why, if I ever need to refresh it, I just, don't listen. I mean, I don't listen to the music. I don't really consciously listen to the music because it's all pretty much in my head anyway.
Yeah.
If I listen to it, I might listen to an isolated track or something. But it gets old.
What I tend to do is I leave it resting for a while, the music as such, and listen to other stuff. And then every once in a while, over a weekend, I'll start at Please Please Me and I'll play every single album over the course of a weekend from start to finish. Yeah. And that's my fix. A couple of times a year, that's all I need. And then every couple of years, I'll sit through the whole anthology box set of DVDs. I'll make a point of binging all of that again, And it was good to see this again. Again, I watched it myself this morning after watching it back in November for the first time in X amount of years. And watching it again, second time in quick succession, thoroughly enjoyed it. And I spotted things even now that I hadn't noticed before or had forgotten. Yeah. So, it was a nice refresher. And as I say, it's a perfect introduction to anybody that needs to know the John Lennon story. So
we were saying, that Complete Beatles kind of has that same role. But having done a podcast about it, we actually found ourselves kind of trashing it a bit because the production values on Complete Beatles are pretty dreadful.
It's trapped in its own time, isn't it, that thing? It was. But, to me, watching it on VHS, I've got a digital downloaded copy of it now. But it must have been transferred from the VHS, so it's exactly like watching it on an old VHS player, to be honest. Yeah. Definite early 80s documentary that's cobbled together almost, because a lot of the music rights they couldn't get for some of the stuff as well, and there's hardly any music in it whatsoever. Yeah,
that's more of a kind of a grainy thing, But this is only 6 years later, and as you said, it probably didn't cost that much, but they've obviously gone for a bit more production values, because I watched it on a fairly decent telly last night, and it was very, very clear and very nice. And the thing that really leapt out is that, I don't know if this is a good thing or not, but they've sort of slathered echo on all the recordings, and they've speeded half of them up. Did you notice that?
No.
I don't know if it was an illusion, but because when you speed things up, they should go into a higher key. Yeah. There was one that absolutely leapt out. I think it's From Me to You from the Washington Coliseum.
Yes.
And they used the studio version. I think that was the only time, because they do that a lot on this film. It just seemed really silly to use the recorded version. And it was really speeded up, and it just looked completely wrong. But,
it looked. I spotted that it wasn't the actual sort of soundtrack itself.
But then they when they were at Shea Stadium, they used the studio version of Help, and it seemed to be fine. But it seemed speeded up, and it seemed to work because it just made it seem even more breathless.
Yeah, that's the point, yeah.
Than it normally is. So it didn't really bother me, but they definitely put loads of echo. I mean, I don't think we'll be able to go through this all chronologically. That's going to take hours, so we might skip around a little bit.
That's fine.
When they get to Woman, where they're naked once again.
Yeah, that's a bit disturbing, actually. That's bordering on sex tape, isn't it, that one?
Because they show the Two Virgins cover, but they just flash it on the screen.
Yeah, but then they're quite happy to show them naked on the bed together.
Yeah, from 1980 as well.
Yeah.
And not to be ageist, but, they're not... they didn't look that good on Two Virgins. They're very skinny and sort of...
Yeah, but they're in
John's
love.
Not very toned, is he? They're in love, yeah. But on Woman, there's all these backing vocals. I think they must be on the recording, but they're so high up in the mix. All these sort of... Ooh.
Yeah.
Sounds like a really different song now.
Is it because it's in 5.1 stereo that it's now been re-recorded in or something? Who knows? It could be absolutely anything, couldn't it? I'm not no technical expert with regard to that sort of thing, but...
It's a funny association between John Lennon and echo. Reverb and echo gives it a dreamy quality.
Yeah.
And the thing about this film, I mean, I'd probably call it a criticism, not as a watching experience, but ever since, the 9th of December 1980, I think the world kind of has chosen to remember John Lennon as a peacenik. Which is fine, it's better than remembering as as a Hamburg drunk,
True.
You know what I mean? But this film is kind of tailored towards that image.
Yeah, the Beatles thing takes a back seat here. That's obvious. Probably a conscious decision on behalf of Yoko that story has been told a dozen times before. She's got access to all of these home movies and her own personal memories. It's her tribute to him. 8 years after he died, and it's the first major documentary I think we had. I don't think there was anything. There might have been a couple of TV tributes or stuff like that, but it's the first in-depth thing we've had since his death. And it was a major... I remember it being a major release, as I say, with the soundtrack album. It was all cross-promoted. It was everywhere. You walked into an Hour Price or whatever it may have been back then. It was all over the place. It was pre-DVD. It was still VHS days.
Mm-hmm. And
from what I remember, they were flying off the shelves. They were just everywhere.
I'd imagine it's doing steady business now. I mean, well, do you count illegal downloads as steady business?
Well,
hopefully
really.
People are still buying the product,
Yeah, I bought the DVD copy when it came out. I've still got the CD. And it's not a bad little soundtrack to play if you want a potted history of John Lennon. It's not got everything on there, but it's got the important stuff and some interesting demos, as we say. So it's certainly worth dipping into, yeah.
Yeah, because I noticed as well, a lot of the songs on here, they make cuts of them, and it's fine, actually. I think George Martin may have done that, but they cut them in quite interesting ways. They don't cut them off. They'll cut to a later part of the song.
Yeah.
They do the Twist and Shout, for example.
Yeah.
Some of the versions, I think of the solo ones, they sound a bit like demos.
They may well be. It may have been their chance to use them,
Yeah.
Which is probably what makes it even more interesting, because it takes something you're quite familiar with, but gives it a slightly different slant, a different spin, and it catches your attention because, hang on a minute, he sung that phrase slightly different to the version that I know.
Well, I'll give you an example, because the song Beautiful Boy?
Yes.
The title of the song is Beautiful Boy brackets Darling Boy.
Yes.
And of course on the recording that we know he sings Darling Sean, but on this one he sings Darling Boy, so it's obviously
there you
the same one.
Yeah, it's an early demo or different version of it, yeah.
And something flashed through my mind. I actually prefer Darling Boy because it makes it a bit more universal.
Rather than Darling Sean.
Just having Sean, I mean, it's not an issue. I mean, Yoko, you can't really change that.
You can't change that, it's all about Yoko, that's right.
Darling. Oh no, Darling's already been done,
Yeah, someone else did that, didn't they?
Yeah, someone else. Have you got chronological notes?
I have, for the first time, because I know you're a stickler for detail. So when I sat there last night, but it is literally just words, random words. That's all I've got. So
that's a scandalous accusation. No, what it is, I write. I start something going, and I just start going with notes. My mind just goes crazy, and I end up with way too much. So
I've just written. It's almost like a list of names and song titles. That's all it is.
Well, I'll tell you what. All we're going to do is I've got something like 4 or 5 A4 slides, which we're never going to get through.
Yeah.
Could we use your prompts, and then we'll
okay. Well, from the top, the movie opens up at Tittenhurst, which is obviously what we're familiar with from our previous episode. And it's the making of Imagine, which is the running theme. It starts off with Yoko, Phil Spector. And as we said, it's just that interesting two storylines running together, but they don't interfere with each other, if you know what I mean. I think I've tried to explain this earlier. That it's not jarring at all that we're getting the making of the Imagine album interspersed with the John Lennon biography.
Because in a way, the footage is so amazing that it doesn't really matter. I think that's one of the things.
Yeah.
I had a question for you, actually. Well, it starts with one quote, which I've always remembered word for word, which is, he says, "I always was a rebel. On the other hand, I wanted to be loved and accepted by all facets of society and not be some lunatic poet." Mm-hmm. So it's interesting that even in the first seconds, you've got a contradiction. John Lennon was all about contradictions, that not consciously, but he says, "I want to be a rebel, but I want to be loved by everyone," and that's part of the appeal of him. But the question I had for you is that when the camera's swooping over, is that all their property?
I'm wondering that because it was 99 acres, wasn't it?
No, I think we talked about this last time. It's actually 71.
Right.
Julian says 99.
Yeah.
But, 71's not bad.
That's a fair old plot, isn't it?
But could it really be all... It looks like Windsor Great Park, which is the park where I used to go with my family when I was a kid, which isn't a million miles from Ascot, actually.
Yeah, it seemed quite a big expanse of land. I mean, 71 acres sounds a great deal, but I don't know, when you look at it on a map, it's probably just a little dot, to be honest. Yeah, it's probably surrounding countryside. I
defended the Imagine No Possessions thing last time, but I was watching it last night and thinking, that can't be your back garden, my friend,
No, they had a fair expanse of land, but it wasn't all of that. No.
Well, it might be, I don't know. We might find out. In the other film, there's also an aerial shot when it was Jealous Guy, if you remember the one with the
they're following the car, yeah.
I think that was all their land, but that didn't seem as much as what we saw.
That helicopter shot, yeah, it just seems miles and miles, basically, yeah.
Yeah, we've got like a little bit of them in 71, something we saw before when he's on the toilet. And
oh, yeah, of course, yeah.
I like the bit where he says, people say, "Why are you recording your life like a diary?" And he says, with the Beatles, every album and every song was a diary of our lives. That was good.
Yeah, probably was, wasn't it? They were documenting things, song lyrics reflecting what was going on around them. When you look at the albums, the early albums compared to the mid-period, compared to the later stuff.
Another thing, keeping a diary. I mean, I know he kept a paper diary as well as documenting his life. It's what they call in America journaling. Is actually a therapeutic exercise. And I mean, I've been doing it myself for years, and I keep a diary, and it's not like, woke up at 9 o'clock, went to work, came home. It's a diary of my perceptions and my thoughts. And it's funny, because it was the end of the decade, I think this is going out in February. People are hearing this in February. So the end of last year was the end of the decade. And I kind of read them back. And, me personally, I mean, amazing personal journey in those 10 years. So I definitely think that there's a therapeutic aspect to him documenting his life. Yeah. I don't think it's just self-indulgence. There's probably some self-indulgence in it. But
that would be an incredible thing to read, actually, if they ever got published.
My diaries or his?
No, well, both.
His diary of the last 2 years of his life was apparently stolen by a fellow called Fred Seaman. Have you ever come across that name?
No.
He wrote a book called Living on Borrowed Time.
Right.
I think his auntie or something was Sean's nanny, so that's how that was his in to the family. And he was a young bloke of probably early 20s who became John Lennon's personal assistant. Right. And if you ever get a chance to read that book, I mean, it's just electrifying. But the John Lennon in the Dakota is this remarkable figure, kind of a jaded mystic almost. Fred Seaman said he had amazing knowledge about almost everything because he's a massive reader.
Yeah.
He also was just basically hanging around his house, just living in his own cocoon and doing nothing. So Fred Seaman's story was that he promised Julian that Julian could have John's diaries if John died. And Fred Seaman also talks about loads of stuff about John thought he was going to get shot or thought he was going to die prematurely.
Yeah.
But the Yoko estate, their version is that Fred Seaman stole the diaries.
Right.
So there is a John Lennon probably still out there, but it's more like, I think a lot of it is cartoons, little drawings.
I can imagine actually, yeah, doodles and things, yeah.
Do you remember the bit in this one where you see him doing another sketch of him and Yoko? Do you remember that?
Yes, bit? Because it's the bit where the police have seized pornographic artwork, as they called it, or something.
The erotic lithograph. And then there's a very quick shot of Salvador Dali. If you notice that, that's bizarre. I remember watching that when I was a kid, and I was so envious because I suppose I'm an artist in one way in that I write and I'm a podcaster and a musician, but I always think of an artist as someone who can draw. And when I remember, even when I was 13, 14, every time I saw that, I was thinking, oh, God, I'm so envious. I want to have, like, long hair, centre-parted, round glasses and be able to draw like that. You know, I wanted to be that John Lennon. The 1968 John Lennon is the coolest one. Did you ever get any of that, of wanting to be John Lennon? Or?
If I ever did, it would have been the early John Lennon. It would have been the rock and roll rebel. It would have been the leather jacket John Lennon, I think. The John Lennon on the cover of the rock and roll album. That would have been me.
Well, there's so many John Lennons in this film, and that's what's so amazing about the guy, you know.
This is the thing, and you notice it as well, particularly from the 70s, from Imagine to 1980, that transition is incredible. I mean, we are fully aware of Hamburg John to Mop Top to Pepper, you know, to that side of John. Yeah. But when you go through, from Imagine through to The Lost Weekend, through to Walls and Bridges Double Fantasy, 1980, that's a great story anyway, that whole, you know, decade itself. And watching him change, the hair length, the beards, all of those things, the white suits, the floppy hats, it's as fascinating a story as the Beatles story itself, I think.
Yeah, I think one of the advantages of having a kind of, let's call it an official version, a sort of Yoko-sanctioned version.
Yes.
Other than the fact that I think Yoko was quite generous to actually have May Pang in this at all.
Yeah.
Or Cynthia. We'll get to that later. But this Yoko-sanctioned version, in a way, official versions of things, because they're generally more simple. The truth is probably a lot messier.
Oh, yeah.
They work well because, like Complete Beatles, you just get this lovely kind of journey, which almost encompasses almost everything that everyone goes through, really. You know, I mean, most young lads will probably have a drinking phase.
Yeah.
Certainly in England, it's probably hard to avoid it.
Yep.
They're not all going to be rock and rollers, but they'll all go through a sort of rebellious stage, and then they might clean up a bit in their 20s. It's very interesting that he's so all-encompassing, and that's what I've really got from really doing this podcast.
Well, you got to remember as well, it's only in 40 years. He wasn't an old man when he died either. You know, he'd just turned 40. Incredible wealth of experience that man crammed into such a short lifetime.
Oh, yeah.
Incredible when you think about it. Yeah.
Should we go back to our chronology?
Yeah,
let's at least make an attempt.
Let's see if we can get past the first 5 minutes. I mean, we then sort of see the first of a few period interview clips. I think there's one with Dick Cavett is right at the beginning here. And then this is the bit where we meet Aunt Mimi, the interview with Aunt Mimi. And he sings Mother, and he talks about Julia from some old interview, you know, about what happened when his mum was run over, and his bitterness in his voice where he talks about the drunk off-duty police. You can just hear it in the way he describes what happens. So it's all this sort of stage of his life. It was still pre-Beatles, was still pre-Quarrymen, and it just comes up to the point where we see our first sort of on-screen interview with Cynthia Lennon, who's the first one to be interviewed on screen rather than archive footage.
I briefly met Cynthia Lennon when I lived in England. I mean, I'm back in England now, but in the era before I became a teacher, I guess 90s mainly, I used to go to Beatles events across the country. I used to live in Leicester, so somewhere around, it wasn't Leicester, but it might have been either Derby or Nottingham, one of those towns. And they had an event and she was there. And I just met her briefly, and she just came across exactly like you'd imagine, just a kind of normal, nice lady. But we were a bit cheeky. I mean, I was only like 21, 22. We said, well, someone like bring Yoko into the conversation. And it's not a nice thing to do. I was 21. I give myself an out there. And someone said something, and her eyes went to the ceiling. Rolled her eyes, and that was it.
But you always get this impression of Cynthia as being this sweet woman with no bitterness whatsoever. And later on, when we get to Banger and the Maharishi and all this lot, and she actually says, you know, that she knew this was the point. I mean, we'll get to that in a second as well.
I'm glad you're confident we're going to get to Banger.
Well, you never know. We might have to split this into 2 episodes as well, the rate we're going at the moment. But yeah, you know, she describes her feelings, and she knew the exact point where it had all gone wrong. She can pinpoint that down.
And do you not think realistically, do you think in a parallel world where Yoko Ono didn't exist that they would have stayed together? Because, I don't know, I'm not saying for a second that normal is a bad thing, but maybe John Lennon just he's clearly looking for something.
I think they all were at the time. I mean, Paul McCartney was with Jane Asher until sort of 68, 69, wasn't he? And then Linda came along. George and Patty stuck through for a little while, didn't they? And Maureen and Ringo, at least through to the early 70s, didn't they?
Well, of course, Maureen had an affair with George. Did you know?
That was it, yeah.
Patty, of course, that didn't actually last very long. I mean, Patty Boyd was so gorgeous. Let's be honest, and even if you're George Harrison, you've got a wife who's that gorgeous and you're hanging around horny musicians all the time.
Oh, Eric Clapton for a start, yeah.
Like Eric Clapton, for example, yeah. There must be so much paranoia around that,
Yeah, and as I say, people always say this whole John Lennon, Yoko Ono thing, the breakup of the Beatles was all surrounded. It wasn't. The group was in decline before Yoko came about. Who knows? There's a lot of what-ifs with the Beatles. What if Pete Best still stayed on drums? What if Stuart Sutcliffe was still about? You could create a whole different band and a whole different history for them. But what we've got is fascinating anyway, and I love the four that we've got and the story. But yeah, a lot of what-ifs,
One thing I wanted to fill in, actually, that this is very strange. You probably don't know this, actually, because I only found it out quite recently with Mark Lewison's tune-in book.
Yeah.
Julia wasn't killed by a drunk policeman. That wasn't actually true.
Right.
He was an off-duty learner-driver policeman.
Right, okay.
Yeah, who ended up becoming a postman, and Menlove Avenue, Mendipps, wasn't on his, what do you call it?
His round.
His round, thank you. But Fourth Lynn Road was, so he was delivering, to 24th Lynn Road at some point, Paul's house. What had actually happened, this is bizarre, you know that Julia had a common-law husband called Dykins?
Yes.
What actually happened was that he was a bit of a fan of the sauce, drinking. And what actually happened was 3 weeks before Julia died, he'd been involved in a drink-driving incident on Menlove Avenue.
No.
I think, if memory serves me rightly, driven into a lamppost or something. And so I think what happened was that John Lennon must have put those two things together and decided it was a drunk cop, or probably, in the aftermath of, 17-year-old boy who finds out his mother's been run over and killed, probably in anger, is looking for anything to
pin the blame. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. So that's only come out recently, has it?
Yeah, I'd say Mark Lewison's tune-in book. He's doing this trilogy. Mark Lewison's obviously not only knowledgeable, but he's a great interviewee.
Yeah.
Every time he does an interview now, he says at the beginning, "Don't ask me when the second volume's coming out," because it was due out this year, 2020.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah.
But the amount of research that man does, I mean, we can grant him a bit of time, surely, can't we? Because the finished product is always worth reading, everything that man does. It's so in-depth.
Yeah, he read, he admits he's pretty obsessive. He read every copy of the Liverpool Echo for over a 20-year period, cover to cover.
That's dedication for you.
Well, I like to think maybe he skimmed a few pages.
Yeah, hopefully the sport or something at least,
Yeah.
The TV page.
Yeah. And this guy Dykins, like I said, when he had this drink driving incident, he was represented by Rex Makin, who was Brian Epstein's solicitor.
Oh, wow. So it's all interlinked, isn't it? It's just all convoluted into one big mess. Yeah.
Go on, back to you.
Yeah, so chronologically with this movie, we get Cynthia Lennon talking about how she met John, and this is the Quarrymen period. So we get a few shots of the Village Fete, the famous photo of them on the back of the float, and we go into Hamburg. It's still pre-Fab Four Beatles, and I'm assuming it was a contemporary interview. Alan Williams appears at this point. I'm assuming that was recorded for this documentary. I'm not too sure.
Could well be, yeah. Because it's not the same as Incomplete Beatles.
No.
I think Complete Beatles, it looks a bit younger.
Yeah.
One of the things about the Hamburg footage, another thing that only came out actually last year, on YouTube you can see a German documentary, which is all that footage, of people fighting. And
yeah, which obviously isn't a Beatles concert, is it? That's just stock footage.
No, it is from the same period.
Yeah.
It's quite weird that I was kind of joking to someone who was on my show. I said, I wonder if like a few months down the line, someone analyses that film and you'll see like, we said like George Harrison's leg in the middle of the... It's the Beatles.
It is a Beatles concert, yeah, but that just looked like it was too big a stage for it to be the Star Club or somewhere like that, because I just imagine them being like real sort of grimy, almost cavern type, establishments. But that just seemed to be a bit more of a larger scale venue, that footage. So they've just used that, haven't they? But when you see some of the streetwalkers and the drunk men in Germany and things like that, that's a fascinating insight. It's a shame that there is no real footage of them out in Germany.
I mean, still though, that film was from the same period. So it's quite amazing to have that. I was talking to a friend about this. I think that footage does sort of slightly heighten the Hamburg. Mm-hmm. When you see it all together. It's like people fighting everywhere. I mean, there was genuine danger in those clubs. Yes. But again, through reading Mark Lewison's book, there was danger, but it wasn't quite as concentrated as all that. It wasn't just constantly... No. I mean, and they were playing throughout the night, weren't they, for like 12 hours at a time. And their only sort of record of that period is Astrid's photographs, really, isn't it? That's our only sort of visual documentation, isn't it? And I think that's where that famous album sleeve for rock and roll comes from as well, isn't it? That's Hamburg, obviously, isn't it? That period of him with the leather jacket and the DA haircut. Yeah, well, that's Jürgen Vollmer, who was one of... There were three Germans, Astrid, Klaus and Jürgen, and Klaus, as you know, is the bass player on the Imagine.
Yes, he is, yeah.
Yeah, quite amazing. Of course, we have the Star Club tape, which is interesting because that was right at the end of 1962, the famous one, which has really been cleaned up and sounds amazing.
I haven't heard the new copy of it. I've got the vinyl from when it originally came out with that dodgy cartoon cover.
You talked about that before. Yeah. I don't know if it's been an official clean-up, but on YouTube, people use their own software. But what's very interesting about that is that I remember even from the first time, you can hear John Lennon's rhythm guitar, which arguably you can't through any of the EMI. It's very, very driving. And,
So we move on from there. We go into the cavern, which is that famous footage, again, of them performing in the cavern and Brian in the background. Love Me Do playing in the background. Then we get another interview with George Martin on screen, closely followed by the Royal Variety performance.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is great. Lovely snapshot. Absolutely fantastic, because they weren't at their peak, but they were just about to explode at this point, weren't they? It's 63, isn't it? A couple of number ones under their belt at this point, and there was no stopping them. And it's a lovely bit of colour footage. Yeah,
that's great. I think actually that colour footage is from Manchester.
Oh, is it? Okay, because it's sort of interspersed with the Royal Variety stuff, isn't it?
That's right. Well, they do this great sort of compilation of different performances of Twist and Shout, don't they?
Yes.
I kind of like having the studio version because the studio version is so amazing.
Yeah, isn't that the one that they recorded last, wasn't it? They saved it, didn't they, till last? And that's why you get that unique, raspy John Lennon voice, that vocal.
Yeah, and I always loved at the end, you can hear someone go, oh! Like, oh. I mean, he had a sore throat all that day, and he was... the engineer said he was sucking lozenges and smoking Stuyvesant cigarettes.
Yeah.
What was I going to say? What was just before the Royal Variety?
George Martin was speaking. There was the Love Me Do, and there was just the bit in the cavern with Brian Epstein.
It's hard to watch George Martin and not think of Big Drain occasionally.
I always admired George Martin. He's a main part of the complete Beatles. He's the main source of info. Yeah. And he's a very generous interviewee. He's not shy about giving information about the technical side of things and his relationship with the four of them. And I don't know, his love for that group as a whole is always evident in every interview that he ever gives. Yeah. And it's such a sad loss that he died a couple of years ago, but Giles has sort of taken over, hasn't he, with that side of things. He is one of the most important parts of Beatles history. And I'm just glad there are a lot of interviews with him that we can tap into and just see exactly what he thought and, his processes and his technical wonders. It's just a marvellous, marvellous piece of the Beatles story.
Yeah. The Big Train thing, for anyone who doesn't know, I'll put a link to that because it is amazing. Just to give you a little sample, mate, just for anyone who hasn't seen it, it's one of the Big Train guys, obviously dressed up as him, and he's a hostage. It's like, who was the envoy who was...
Terry Waite.
Terry Waite, in Lebanon, wasn't it? Yeah. Anyway, George Martin and someone else are taken hostage, and all George Martin does is keep telling all the Beatles stories.
That's it.
The stories he tells. And then they go to a press conference, and they said, it's a big press conference. Someone said, Mr. Martin, do you think this this hostage crisis, I don't know exactly what they said, but will spark off further incidents in the future. And he says, I never really understood the criticisms of Ringo's drumming. For me, he was a perfect drummer for the Beatles. He gave them the drive that they required and stuff like that.
John and Paul were always very encouraging. And this was actually one of the rather nice things about working with the Beatles. They didn't have any of this ego nonsense that you get with a lot of supergroups.
In the early days, particularly, John and Paul had a very relaxed attitude towards songwriting. For example, Can't Buy Me Love was written in a hotel room. They just sat down and knocked it out together.
They'd stop writing together quite so much. They'd still contribute to each other's songs. People working out is a good example.
Okay, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We're about to start a press conference now. Mr. Hooper and Mr. Martin are extremely tired, and we'll only be asking a few questions now, okay? So thank you very much. Mr. Martin.
Do you think the release represents a positive shift in attitudes towards the West, or is it just a publicity stunt?
Well, I never really understood all the criticisms against Ringo's drumming. As far as I was concerned, he was an inventive and powerful player. You only have to listen to some tracks like, I don't know, Tomorrow Never Knows, Hey Jude, Strawberry Fields. I could go on. Absolute tour de force.
Oh,
but that was the thing. Throughout this whole 80s period, he was the turn-to interviewee for anything Beatles related. So if there was an anniversary coming up or whatever, let's get George Martin. He'll always do an interview, and he did. He had this reputation. But the perfect man to talk to. If you can't get one of the Beatles themselves, talk to George Martin. He was there.
Yeah.
You know?
And he has got a great voice, and he's very articulate. And, yeah. All right. So, the Beatlemania period, I mean, in a funny way, the same as with Complete Beatles, covering it quickly kind of adds to the breathlessness of it.
It sets the tone as to where this documentary is going to go. There's Hamburg, there's the cavern. Bang, in a minute we're going to go to America. We'll do the American invasion, we'll do the bigger than Jesus bit. And it's gone. That Beatles story has been told in the space of 40 minutes. Not even that. 30 minutes into the movie that the Beatles have forgotten. We're now on solo John Lennon and Imagine and Yoko, which is great because this is not a movie for people that want the Beatles story. Get that from the anthology. Get that from Complete Beatles if you want a shorter version. This is a completely different beast, and it's great. As I say, it's unique in the way that it tells the story, and it tells two stories of John Lennon's life and the making of the Imagine album.
Absolutely. I can't remember at what point we see him demonstrating the song for those guys.
That's next. The upright piano is just after the Royal Variety performance. That is literally the next scene. So
that's really interesting. I like that quote, actually, just before that, when he says, when I was a Beatle, I thought we were the best fucking group in the goddamn world.
He was probably right.
I'm going to put a little clip. This is a weird little clip, but how much of a fan of Laurel and Hardy are you?
I was watching some this morning.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you remember when he's going through Imagine with the other guys?
Yep.
He goes, you may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one.
Yep.
I hope someday you'll join us in the world. I thought of Trail of the Lonesome Pine.
Well, with the high-pitched voice.
Yeah.
When the voice changes where he hits him on the head. Yeah.
Yeah, he does the low voice, hits him on the head. So listeners, here's a clip for you.
In the blue mountains of Virginia, on the trail of the lonesome pine.
In the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, on the trail of the lonesome pine. In the pale moonshine, our hearts entwine, where she carved her name and I carved mine. Oh, June, like the mountains, I'm blue like the pine. I am lonesome for you.
In the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, on the trail of the lonesome pine.
John Lennon's humour is kind of everywhere, isn't it? Like there's a bit where he pokes his tongue out when he's singing. I think it's How.
Yeah.
That's right at the beginning. Yeah.
It was always one for mugging at the camera. Got quite a lot of stick for pulling those, want of a better phrase, disabled faces that he used to do, didn't he? Quite cruel, apparently. Got quite a bit of backlash from that in later years. But he was always one for not taking anything too seriously.
Yeah, it's interesting actually because I had a lady on my show quite a while ago called Jude, and she'd done a book. She's done a John Lennon series book. We were talking about 64. And a couple of things, I read her book later, she sent it me. It's like 700 odd pages and like 3,000 footnotes.
Yeah.
And guess what? I read all of it. Okay. Crazy. I don't know if I'm a big fan or I've just got OCD. I can't work out which.
Yeah. You're obsessive.
What came out from talking to her in her book is, number one, they were pretty sick of touring by 64.
Wow, okay.
66. Yeah, I mean, they liked it a bit, but I tell you, poor old, what's his name, Derek Taylor.
Yeah.
And Neil Aspinall.
Mm-hmm.
They have to just continually keep having to wake the boys up, and the boys are absolutely knackered.
Yeah.
Say, could you please just do this quick interview outside? And they're like, for fuck's sake, mate, it's the middle of the night, you know.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's amazing when you look back is that you think about Washington Coliseum was February 64, where they were still full-on cuddly mop-tops.
Yes.
And John's doing that, like, clap your hands, and that stamping the feet.
Yeah.
I never thought he did it in, like, high-profile occasions, but obviously he did.
It's caught on camera for the whole world to see, that's the thing. Yeah.
This is what's interesting about their story, is that there's still stuff to know. Like, you know,
yeah, just when you think that every single book has been written, Mark Lewison is still churning them out, thankfully. And as you said, you know, interesting facts are coming out year after year, just when you think you know the story. And
the continued interest will just spark more people to write more amazing books.
Yeah, hopefully that's great. You know, it's the group that keeps on giving, basically.
Yeah, exactly. What stood out for me, really, again, they go through the Beatlemania, and then suddenly you're in 66, and of course, Bigger Than Jesus. And again, it works because in their life, you know, they did go 2 years from cuddly mop tops to sort of talking about Vietnam and the album cover with the dead babies.
Yeah.
The progression is just incredible.
They grew up a lot, I think, in that period. It was a case of having to. They grew up musically and, you know, mentally, I think. You know, gone are the days where they could be pissed out of their heads for 9 hours on stage in Germany. They're flying all over the world at this point. You know, there's the whole Philippines thing that's going to happen in 66. There's the Bigger Than Jesus thing. It's you can imagine why they were getting so fed up. You know, struggling to be heard is always the main reason that's quoted. And, you know, Shea Stadium on stage for 20 minutes or whatever it was. That was it. Yeah, all that fuss for 20 minutes. You know for a fact that they can't hear anything they're playing throughout that whole stadium tour.
In the Ruttles, by the way, it's Che Stadium, as in Che Guevara. The Ruttles are very fresh in my mind because I did a podcast about it, as I said earlier.
Yeah, good old Neil Innes, God bless him. Yes, it's much missed.
Neil, yeah, Cynthia said, mentioned stuff about John being a part-time dad, doesn't she?
This is sort of, briefly mentioned because Julian Lennon appears on screen and says, you know, interspersing with the Ascot stuff, that he spent some time at Tittenhurst. He said, but it's the first time that I ever spent any length of time with my father. And there's an interview that's spoken over by John where he says, I don't remember Julian as a child. I don't remember him because I just didn't have the chance. He was just in the corner occasionally in a room that I might happen to have been in or something.
And of course he'd snap at him, wouldn't he? He admitted this you know, when he's reading the papers. But I was going to say, in Cynthia's book, John, she's written a few books, I think. But I listened to the audio book of the most recent book, and she said when he came back from touring, he was just wiped out. He'd sleep for 3 days. Like, he's completely wiped out, like nothing left. The other thing with Julian, this is kind of a dark story, actually. Julian has said that when he stayed at Tittenhurst Park, this is very weird. John and Yoko actually put him in a room. You know, obviously, I don't know how many rooms a house would have had, but probably 20 or 30 at least, whatever. They put him in a room that was like miles away from their room.
I think I've heard that story, yeah.
Have you heard this story?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
And Julian woke up a couple of times after having a nightmare, went into their room, was kind of told, go back to bed, don't, a bit of darkness in John Lennon for sure.
Was Yoko's child living at the house at the time?
Don't know. No, I think I think the whole thing with her being kidnapped, going on, and the custody case. It's possible. They definitely knew each other.
Because there's footage, isn't there? You can see them getting on and off of airplanes with Yoko's child as well, can't you, in this documentary? But there's no visible footage of them actually at Tittenhurst, you know.
They were both in that car crash that he had in Scotland during the Abbey Road.
Of course.
Where they had the bed in the studio.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a picture of the four of them, and Julian and Kyoko dressed in like full-on tartan.
That's it. Yeah, I've seen that as well. Yeah.
I was pleased years later that Yoko did get back in touch with Kyoko, and now apparently they've been friends, you know, proper mother-daughter for 20-odd years now.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
I was pleased with that. I've never wished Yoko any harm, you know?
No, we sort of had this conversation last time, didn't we, that people's perceptions are based on the animosity that was felt in 1969, 1970.
Yeah, and the British press are very guilty of, you know, racist. I think the word racist now is so sort of tossed about.
Yeah.
You know, with sometimes quite flimsy evidence. Years ago, I went to a library and I saw, like, there was a big archives in London of, like, the papers and stuff. And, you know, some of it's full on. I mean, I suppose Britain's always been known as having one of the most brutal sort of tabloid industries.
God, yeah, it can wreck lives in a headline, a single headline, can't it? I mean, and this is touched upon a bit later, you know, that John says in a later interview that one of the papers describes her as ugly. And he said, I don't think I've seen anybody in the British press, anybody at all, described as ugly. Come to that in a second, you know, but...
We will, yeah.
Yeah.
So where are we up to?
We're up to how I won the war, obviously, after the touring's finished, so he flies off to Spain with Dick Lester and films how I won the war. And then it's it's the new look, John. We go to Abbey Road, it's the pepper era, sort of strawberry fields. We've got the droopy moustache, shorter hair, you know, it's the big sideburns. And then Mr. Martin starts talking about drugs and a day in the life and the LSD. We get to this part of the documentary, 67 onwards now, we're hitting.
Yeah. They all look different, don't they? But I think John more than all of them, I think. Maybe because of the glasses.
The glasses, I think, and the moustache, yeah. But you know it's a different era of music. The creative stuff is allowed to sort of manifest itself a bit more because the pressure of touring's been taken away. And it's a great period in Beatles history, a great period in the Beatles' music output. And they do harp on a little bit in this documentary about the drug side of things. This does get a little bit of attention at this point. But it is fascinating. That whole thing about the interview that Paul gave, you know, and it was the TV thing, wasn't it? And it was their responsibility to broadcast it. He said, I don't want to tell you this. He said, but it's down to you whether you show it or not. And, you know, he got a massive slagging off for it in the press. And then we get the LSD story, the Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, the famous painting. And, again, George Martin saying, well, the boys were quite respectful. If they wanted to smoke something, they'd go up and lock themselves in the canteen rather than do it in the studio.
The Beatles certainly never took drugs in front of me. I was always vehemently against the drugs scene, particularly the heavier stuff, heroin, LSD. But having said that, when we were in the studios, quite often the lads would nip off to the loo for 10 minutes, smoke a bit of pot, come back wreathed in smiles, there'd be a bit of giggling and horseplay, and then we'd carry on with work. But generally, I tended to turn a blind eye.
Actually, a couple of things about that. I think it's very well accepted that they used to put speed in George Martin's drink occasionally.
Yes, I've heard that, yeah.
I think he said something, this is probably like very much second or third hand. I suppose if you had a little bit of that, it'd probably just be like having 5 coffees or something, you know?
Yeah.
I don't think they would have given him like a huge rap or, you know.
George Martin on speed, can you imagine? The most subdued, quiet, mild-mannered man you could ever meet, you know?
Yeah, can you imagine the big train George Martin? How about that? The other thing is that... have you ever heard that audio tape of them doing Think For Yourself when they left the tape running?
Possibly. I've heard a lot of outtakes and bootlegs and things, but...
Towards the end of 65, when they were doing Rubber Soul, they decided that they didn't want their Christmas record scripted.
Okay, right.
Because I think, you know, 65 is kind of the pot year, isn't it, really?
I said so, yeah.
Yeah, one thing we didn't talk about, which we won't go back, but when they get their MBEs, they're clearly all stoned.
Oh, God, yeah.
And having fun with it. That brilliant bit where he goes, "How did you all react?" And I can't do this.
And he does, he does that gesture, doesn't he?
I went, whoopee.
I went, whoopee. Yes, we're smoking marijuana in the toilet in Buckingham Palace. Yeah,
it's never quite been ascertained whether that's true or not. Because George said it was a cigarette. George Harrison. Anyway, what I was going to say was, at the end of 65, they decided, we don't want to script it. So George Martin left the tapes running while they're doing "Think For Yourself," you know, the George Harrison song. And it's all now on YouTube. I'll put a link again. It's like 19 minutes.
Yeah.
And then I wouldn't say it's spontaneous. They're trying quite hard to be funny. But there is a funny bit where you clearly hear John go off to the toilet. They use a code. I think their code was like to have a laugh, meant to go and have a joint.
Oh, right.
They carry on with the harmonies, and then you hear the footsteps come back. And I think someone says something that he's clearly been in the toilet. But it's just so funny because you think of Rubber Soul. I mean, it's such a huge album and it was taken so seriously, but there's this sort of down-home thing. They're just four Scouse blokes getting a bit high and recording some music on one level.
Being allowed to be a little bit more creative than what they were before. Getting away from the rock and roll stuff. Let's just try this, you know. And it works, obviously, yeah.
Sorry, go on.
No, as I was saying, it works, obviously, you know. Everyone pretty much is in agreement that Rubber Soul, Revolver, two of the best albums they ever released. It depends what era of the Beatles you like.
There's so many Beatles and there's so many Lennons.
Yeah, no,
I think Rubber Soul, for me, is like the pinnacle of the kind of fairly standard, in the best way possible, 2 to 3 minute pop song.
Yeah.
Not that Rubber Soul's really standard, of course, because...
no.
In 2 years, they've gone from She Loves You, Yeah, 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 to, you know, Was She Told When She Was Young That Pain Would Lead to Pleasure, for example.
Exactly, yeah.
You know, but they hadn't gone into the Indian thing quite yet.
Not quite.
Yeah. And then Brian dies.
Yeah, we've got the whole banger thing that we were talking about, which obviously happened when they were away, wasn't it? They got word while they were in Bangor and came back. But there's some, obviously, the quite famous footage of them running for the train. And Cynthia gets sort of lost in the crowd, and the policeman puts his arm up and stops her from, you know, boarding the train.
Yeah.
And we sort of alluded to this earlier, and she says, that's it. She said it was at that particular point, she actually says, I think I'm getting off at this station.
Yeah.
That's what she says. She knew that it wasn't going to work. She'd accepted her lot in life. Yoko isn't on the horizon at this point. She isn't part of John's life, so it's nothing to do with Yoko. It's just the fact that she was a Beatle wife with a very young child, and for the foreseeable future, things were not going to change. There never appears to be any bitterness with her. I think we sort of hinted at this earlier.
We did, yeah.
And she tells the story well. Again, another good interviewee. And it's another sort of facet that you don't see that often. I mean, she wasn't part of Anthology. I don't think she was interviewed for Anthology, was she?
No.
So it's nice to see this in 1988, to get a record of what, you know, her actual thoughts and feelings were at the time.
I wasn't sure, actually, years ago when I saw this, you actually do see her being stopped by the policeman in the footage. That is her,
She's
right?
very young, very long hair. Yeah. No glasses, obviously, but that is her. Yeah, very pretty when she was younger. Well, she was still pretty when she was, you know, an older lady as well, but definitely her, yeah.
Yeah, this is the last Ruttles reference I'll make.
Go for it.
Instead of Brian Epstein dying, their manager Leggy Mountbatten, they hit by the shock news that he had accepted a teaching post in Australia.
Still makes me laugh when I hear Leggy Mountbatten.
And they go to Bognor instead of Bangor. You know, I could go on. I won't go on. It's quite funny. And then Maharishi's called Arthur Sultan.
That's it.
It's just a guy with glasses.
That's it. Yeah. I've got to watch that again now. You're just
It's on YouTube, actually, the whole film.
I've got DVD of it somewhere, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Fantastic.
It's remarkably short. It's only 1 hour 10 or something.
It was shown on sort of ITV, wasn't it, when it was originally made? I think it was specifically made for LWT, wasn't it?
Yeah. It was originally Rutland Weekend Television.
Weekend Television, that was it.
Which is a play on London Weekend Television, isn't it? Fantastic. So that's where we'll leave it. We are about halfway through the conversation. Got to 67, as you can see there. Didn't actually get to the solo career yet, but we do pretty much manage to cover the film chronologically. Nice to end on something completely unrelated to the imagined film there, the Ruttles. But I suppose there was a tenuous link to what we were talking about, and that was fresh in my mind because I'd done the commentary with Ed Chen of When There Was Fab. You may have heard that. Forgot to mention actually at the beginning of the show that this is actually the first anniversary of the podcast. I put the first episode online on February the 7th, 2019. So we've notched up a year, done 30-odd episodes, including the bonus ones. And I'm going to get the second part of this talk out in a week's time. And I think the podcast is going to go weekly until the end of March and possibly beyond. It's always a bit hard to tell because editing does take time, and but in terms of new episodes, I'm already preparing a pretty massive one that's going to be recorded at the end of February. I don't think I'll tell you what it's about now, but it's about quite a contentious topic regarding John Lennon. And it's with a fellow who puts out podcasts of inordinate lengths, 5-6 hours. I think the longest one he's ever done is 8 or 9 hours about propaganda. I listened to that, it was fantastic. But he's certainly the guy you need if you want to just have a extremely freewheeling conversation. So I don't know how long we'll go for, but there'll be plenty to talk about regarding the topic and other things. So yeah, it's looking good for now. I'm not going to think too far ahead, but I'm going to say that, certainly until the summer, the podcast should be going strong, and then we'll take it from there. So the music will be coming up. I'm very excited for you to hear this last bit of music, which will be the regular outro music. So it's probably coming into your ears now as I speak. So thank you very much for listening as ever, and I will see you in a week's time. Take care and goodbye.
Yeah, that's the one I like best.